cold water presses against steel 3 kilometers below the surface. The darkness here is absolute. No light has touched these plates since 1941. An ROV's beam cuts through suspended particles, revealing a massive curved section of armor emerging from the silt. The metal is dark, covered in rust and marine growth, but the scale is unmistakable. This is not debris. This is architecture. The bow of HMS Hood rests on its side, anchor chains still secured, the ship's forward structure preserved in water so cold it slows decay to a crawl. The wreck stretches across the seafloor in 3 distinct sections, each one separated by hundreds of meters of empty ocean floor. Between them lies scattered steel, fragments of a ship that ceased to exist in less than 3 minutes. The North Atlantic kept this location secret for decades. Now the footage reveals what the cold darkness has protected. HMS Hood was not just a warship, she was a statement. Launched at the John Brown shipyard in Scotland on August 22, 1918, she measured 262 meters from bow to stern and displaced 47,000 tons when fully loaded. For 20 years, no ship in any navy matched her size. The Royal Navy called her the Mighty Hood. To the British public, she was the symbol of naval supremacy, the floating embodiment of an empire that still believed itself unshakable. Her main armament consisted of 8 15-inch guns mounted in 4 turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft. Each shell weighed nearly a ton. The guns could hurl these projectiles over 29 kilometers with enough force to penetrate the thickest battleship armor of the era. Her secondary battery included 12 5.5-inch guns, designed to fend off destroyers and cruisers. Anti-aircraft weapons lined her superstructure, though they would prove inadequate against the threats she would face. Hood's armor belt ran along her waterline 12 inches thick at its maximum, tapering to 5 inches at the bow and stern. But her deck armor told a different story. The horizontal protection above her magazines measured only 3 inches in most places, a design compromise from an era when naval architects expected shells to arrive on flat trajectories, not plunging fire from long range. This weakness would define her fate. She carried a crew of 1,419 men. Officers occupied quarters in the aft superstructure. Ratings bunked in hammocks strung between decks, their lives organized around 4-hour watches and the endless maintenance a ship this size demanded. The engine rooms housed 24 Yarrow boilers, feeding 4 steam turbines that generated 144,000 shaft horsepower. At full speed, Hood could make 32 knots, fast enough to chase down most enemy vessels or escape from those she couldn't defeat. Between the wars, Hood became Britain's most visible warship. She sailed to ports across the empire, showing the flag from Gibraltar to Singapore. Thousands lined harbors to see her pass. Newsreels captured her sleek profile, the long forecastle and graceful lines that made her seem more like a racing yacht than an instrument of war. But by 1941, she was aging. Her last major refit had been incomplete. Modernization plans were postponed because the Navy needed every capital ship at sea. She went into battle against Germany's newest battleship, carrying vulnerabilities her designers never intended. On May 24, 1941, Hood departed Scapa Flow with the battleship Prince of Wales. Their mission was to intercept the German battleship Bismarck and heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, which had broken out into the Atlantic to raid British convoys. Intelligence placed the German ships near Iceland, heading southwest through the Denmark Strait, the narrow passage between Greenland and Iceland, where fog and ice floes made visibility unpredictable. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland commanded the British force from Hood's Bridge. He was 54 years old, a gunnery specialist who had spent his career preparing for exactly this kind of engagement. But he faced a tactical problem. To close the range quickly, and bring all his guns to bear. He would have to approach nearly bow on, exposing Hood's thin deck armor to plunging fire while limiting his own firepower to the forward turrets. At 5:52 a.m. on May 24th, lookouts spotted Bismarck and Prince Eugen emerging from a fog bank 28 kilometers distant. The sea was calm. Visibility was unusually clear for the Denmark Strait. Holland ordered an increase to 28 knots and signaled his ships to prepare for action. Hood's crew had been at battle stations since before dawn, waiting in the cold wind that swept across the North Atlantic. At 5:53, Holland gave the order to open fire. Hood's forward turrets roared, sending 4 one-ton shells toward Bismarck. The German ships returned fire immediately. Prince of Wales engaged seconds later, her guns still suffering mechanical problems from her rushed commissioning. The range was closing at over 300 meters per minute. 3 minutes into the battle, a shell struck Hood near the mainmast. Witnesses aboard Prince of Wales saw a fire erupt on Hood's boat deck. It appeared manageable. The fire crews would have been responding. But Hood kept firing, her guns tracking Bismarck through the gray morning light. At 6 a.m., 8 minutes after the first shots, a German shell struck Hood between her mainmast and aft funnel. The explosion was catastrophic. A massive fireball erupted from the ship's center, climbing hundreds of meters into the sky. The blast was so powerful that it lifted Hood's entire midsection, breaking her back. Her bow and stern sections rose at angles, pointing skyward like a closing book, then slipped beneath the surface. From Prince of Wales, observers watched in disbelief. One moment, Hood was firing, her guns elevated for the next salvo. The next moment, she was gone, replaced by a spreading oil slick and a pillar of smoke that hung in the still air. The entire event took less than 3 minutes from the fatal hit to the moment her stern disappeared. Of the 1,419 men aboard, 3 survived. The ROV descends along the forward hull, its lights revealing armor plating still bearing the dark gray paint applied in Scottish dockyards. The bow rests on its starboard side at a 60-degree angle, partially embedded in soft sediment. The anchor chains are visible in their hawse holes, each link as thick as a man's torso, extending down into the silt where the anchors themselves remain buried. The curve of the hull shows where the breakup occurred. The metal is not cleanly cut. It is torn, ripped along weld seams and plate junctions by forces that pulled the ship apart in seconds. Deck beams protrude from the breakpoint, bent upward and outward. The fracture pattern suggests the explosion originated deeper in the ship, blowing upward and outward simultaneously, shredding everything in its path. The forward superstructure has collapsed inward. What remains of the bridge sits crushed against the deck, compressed by the impact with the seafloor and the weight of the structure above it. The tripod mast, once rising 45 meters above the waterline, now lies twisted across the wreckage. Its supporting struts are bent at impossible angles, each one representing thousands of tons of force, applied in the instant of impact. The forward gun turrets tell their own story. Turret A and B, the 2 forward turrets that Holland relied on during the approach to Bismarck, have separated from their barbettes. Each turret weighed over 800 tons. The impact with the seafloor drove them loose, and they now rest beside the hull, their gun barrels pointing at odd angles into the sediment. One barrel is partially buried. Another extends upward toward the surface 3 kilometers above, as if still tracking an enemy that no longer exists. Closer inspection reveals details the cold water has preserved. Bollards for securing mooring lines still protrude from the deck. Ventilation cowls remain in place, their openings now home to deep-sea anemones. A section of railing runs along what was once the forecastle deck, its stanchions evenly spaced, each one cast in the same foundry somewhere in Britain before the war. The armor belt is intact along most of the bow section. The 12-inch plates show impact marks, dents, and scratches from where Hood brushed against harbor walls or took hits from practice targets during gunnery exercises. But there are no shell holes here. The fatal damage came from inside, not from enemy fire penetrating the bow. 500 meters of empty seafloor separate the bow from the scattered remains of Hood's center. This is where the explosion occurred. The debris field spans an area 200 meters wide and 500 meters long, a scatter pattern consistent with a magazine detonation that ripped the ship apart from within. The largest recognizable piece is a section of the starboard side hull, roughly 30 meters long, lying flat on the bottom. The armor belt is torn away on one side, the metal peeled back like paper. The inner structure is exposed, deck beams and longitudinal frames visible in cross-section. This is not how ships are meant to be seen. These are the bones of the vessel, the internal skeleton that gave Hood her strength, now splayed open for examination. Boiler sections rest scattered across the seabed. Each boiler stood 3 stories tall when intact, a massive steel cylinder lined with tubes that converted coal or oil into superheated steam. Now they lie in pieces, their cylindrical forms crushed and split. Pipes extend from the wreckage in all directions, some still attached to fittings, others torn loose and scattered. The ROV's light catches a pressure gauge, its needle frozen at 0, encrusted with rust but still readable. Fragments of the main deck are visible beneath layers of silt. A section of teakwood planking has somehow survived, the wood dark and compressed, but recognizable as the material that once covered the steel deck beneath officers' feet. Nearby, a brass hatch cover lies face up, its securing dogs still in place, the wheel that would have been used to open it bent but intact. The second funnel, or what remains of it, rests on its side 40 meters from the main debris field. The funnel was 15 meters in diameter, designed to vent exhaust from the forward boiler rooms. The explosion launched it clear of the ship. It hit the water separately and sank on its own trajectory, landing intact before the weight of water flooding its interior crushed it into its current flattened state. Shell casings litter the debris field. These are the brass cartridges from Hood's 5.5-inch secondary guns, each one nearly a meter long. They were stored in magazines near the guns, ready to be loaded into the breech for rapid fire. When the main magazine exploded, the blast scattered these casings across the seafloor like seeds. Some are crushed flat, others remain cylindrical, their bases stamped with production codes from munitions factories in England. Personal items emerge from the silt as the ROV's thrusters disturb the bottom. A boot, its leather preserved by the cold water, sits upright as if still being worn. Fabric fragments drift in the current, pieces of uniform wool that have lost their color but retained their weave. A brass button, stamped with the anchor and crown of the Royal Navy, rests among coral growth. Each item marks where someone stood when the explosion came. The final positions of men who had seconds or less to understand what was happening. The aft section lies nearly intact 700 meters from the bow. Unlike the shattered midsection, the stern came down in one piece, settling onto the seafloor at a slight angle, with the port side lower than starboard. This section includes the aft superstructure, the 2 rear gun turrets, and the propulsion machinery. The propeller shafts extend from the hull, each one 40 centimeters in diameter, designed to transmit the massive torque from the turbines to the 4 bronze propellers. 3 of the propellers are visible, their blades curved and massive, each blade longer than a man is tall. The 4th propeller is buried in the sediment. The blades show no damage from the explosion. They simply stopped turning when the ship's back broke and remained frozen in their final position. The rudder assembly is intact. The rudder itself, weighing over 100 tons, remains attached to its post. The steering gear, the massive hydraulic rams that moved the rudder in response to commands from the bridge, sits exposed where the stern plating has torn away. The machinery is complex, a system of pistons and cylinders that could swing the rudder 35 degrees to either side in less than 30 seconds. It never received a final command. Hood was sinking before anyone could issue orders to turn. Turret X and Y, the two aft turrets, remain in their barbettes. Unlike the forward turrets, these did not separate on impact. They sit at their normal elevation angle, guns pointed slightly upward, as if the crew had been preparing to fire the next salvo when the ship went down. The gun barrels are massive, each one 60 feet long and weighing 100 tons. The elevation gear is visible through gaps in the turret structure, the mechanical linkages that allowed gun crews to adjust the angle of fire still in place. The aft superstructure is crushed, but recognizable. This was where Hood's officers lived and worked. The admiral's cabin, the wardroom, the chart house. All of it is compressed into a tangle of steel, plating, and collapsed decks. The mainmast, which once supported radio antennas and fire control equipment, lies across the wreckage. Its platform, where spotters would have stood to direct gunfire, dangles from twisted support cables. A section of the boat deck remains partially intact. The davits that held the ship's boats are empty, the boats themselves long since torn away by the force of the sinking or rotted away in the decades since. But the davits remain, mechanical arms frozen in their stowed position, waiting to launch boats that will never touch water again. Among the stern wreckage, more personal items appear. A porcelain cup, remarkably intact, sits wedged between two steel beams. Its surface is stained, but the form is perfect, a reminder that minutes before the ship sank, men were drinking tea or coffee, following routines so normal they required no thought. A wrench rests on what was once a catwalk, its jaws still adjusted to fit some specific bolt size, dropped by a mechanic who never finished his task. The cold water has been kind to Hood's stern. In warmer seas, bacteria would have consumed organic materials and accelerated the corrosion of steel. But here, 3 kilometers down, where temperatures hover just above freezing, the wreck decays slowly. Another century might pass before the stern section collapses completely. For now, it remains a monument, the most intact portion of a ship that should never have been so fragile. 3 explanations have competed for decades. Each has evidence. None can be proven with absolute certainty. The first theory points to plunging fire. At the range where Bismarck engaged Hood, shells followed high arcing trajectories, striking the target from above rather than horizontally. Hood's deck armor was thin, designed against an older generation of threats. A 15-inch shell from Bismarck, weighing 800 kilograms and traveling at supersonic speeds, could have punched through the deck above the aft magazine. Once inside, the shell's fuse would have detonated it among the cordite propellant charges. Cordite burns extremely fast. In a confined space, the combustion creates pressure that builds faster than steel can contain it. The magazine would have exploded within milliseconds, the blast traveling through ammunition hoists and passageways until it found the main forward magazine. The resulting explosion would have released the energy equivalent of several hundred tons of TNT in the span of a heartbeat. The wreck supports this theory. The breakpoint is located near the mainmast, directly above where Hood's main magazines were positioned. The tear pattern in the hull suggests outward pressure from below deck, consistent with an internal explosion. Survivors reported seeing the blast originate from the center of the ship, between the funnels, precisely where the magazine spaces were located. The second theory attributes the loss to a torpedo. Prince Eugen fired torpedoes during the engagement. If one struck Hood at the waterline, it could have penetrated to the magazine spaces or created a pressure wave that triggered sympathetic detonation of ammunition stored nearby. Torpedo explosions are particularly destructive because they occur against the ship's skin, creating a bubble of gas that expands and collapses, generating shock waves that can fracture internal bulkheads. This theory has less physical evidence. No torpedo damage is visible on the sections of hull recovered or observed in footage. Hood's anti-torpedo bulges, the external blisters designed to absorb torpedo hits, show no signs of impact. But the missing midsection makes definitive conclusions impossible. The section where a torpedo would have struck is scattered across 500 meters of seafloor in pieces too small to show clear impact signatures. The third theory focuses on Hood's flash protection. After World War I, the Royal Navy installed flash-tight doors and scuttles and ammunition hoists to prevent fire from traveling between decks and reaching magazines. But Hood's refit was incomplete. Some of these protective measures were never installed. Others were bypassed by crew members who found them cumbersome during combat drills. If a fire started on the upper decks, from a shell hit or a secondary explosion, flames could have traveled down ammunition hoists directly into the magazine. The fire observed by Prince of Wales supports this possibility. Witnesses saw flames on Hood's boat deck before the final explosion. The fire was located near the base of the mainmast, close to ammunition passages that led below. If those passages were not properly sealed, fire could have reached the cordite stores within seconds. The explosion that followed matches the timeline. The most likely scenario combines elements of all three. A shell struck Hood's deck, penetrated to a secondary magazine or ammunition locker, and caused a fire or small explosion. The blast or resulting fire reached the main magazine through inadequate flash protection. The main magazine exploded, breaking the ship's back and triggering secondary explosions as other ammunition stores detonated. The entire sequence took less than 10 seconds from initial hit to catastrophic failure. No matter which theory is correct, the underlying cause remains the same. Hood was designed in 1916, launched in 1918, and sent into battle in 1941 with vulnerabilities her creators never imagined. Naval warfare had evolved. Hood had not. She met a ship designed 25 years later, built with lessons learned from her generation. The outcome was never truly in doubt. The icy North Atlantic has kept Hood's remains in a state of preservation rare for shipwrecks. In warmer waters, steel corrodes rapidly, consumed by bacteria and chemical reactions accelerated by temperature. But at 3 kilometers depth, where the water temperature remains between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius year-round, biological activity slows to nearly nothing. The bacteria that typically feast on shipwrecks cannot survive here. Corrosion continues, but at a glacial pace. Another century will pass before Hood's stern collapses completely. The bow section may last even longer. The wreck was discovered in 2001 by a deep-sea expedition led by David Mearns. Finding it required reconstructing the battle from survivor accounts and German records, estimating where Hood would have drifted as she sank, and scanning thousands of square kilometers of seafloor with sonar. The search took weeks. When the sonar returns finally showed a large object on the bottom, the team deployed an ROV for visual confirmation. The first images showed armor plating covered in rust but clearly manufactured, not natural. Then the anchor chains appeared, and there was no doubt. Since the discovery, several expeditions have visited the site. Each one adds details to the understanding of what happened. High-resolution sonar maps the debris field with centimeter accuracy. Cameras capture images of artifacts that shift position as ocean currents slowly move sediment. The data accumulates, building a picture of Hood's final moments more complete than any survivor testimony could provide. The British government designated the wreck as a war grave. No artifacts may be removed. The site is protected under maritime law and military tradition. Hood is not an archaeological curiosity. She is a cemetery, the final resting place of 1,416 men whose families never received bodies to bury. Every piece of debris, every scattered artifact, every fragment of steel represents someone's father, brother, son, husband. The protection order ensures they remain undisturbed. For the Royal Navy, Hood's loss marked the end of an era. The battleship age was already fading, though few recognized it at the time. Aircraft carriers would prove to be the decisive weapons of the Pacific War. Battleships would serve as shore bombardment platforms and anti-aircraft escorts. Important roles, but not the decisive naval combat their designers envisioned. Hood was the last of her kind to die in the kind of surface action battleships were built for, a gun duel between capital ships on the open ocean. The three survivors, Ordinary Signalman Ted Briggs, Able Seaman Bob Tilburn, and Midshipman William Dundas, spent the rest of their lives telling Hood's story. Briggs, in particular, became the keeper of the ship's memory, giving interviews and attending commemorations until his death in 2008. He described the explosion as instantaneous, a flash of light and heat followed by the sensation of falling as the deck dropped away beneath his feet. He entered the water among debris and oil, swimming clear of the sinking ship by instinct. Prince of Wales rescued him and the other two survivors within minutes. The rest of the crew disappeared with their ship. The wreck lies in darkness, 3 kilometers below the surface, in water so cold and still that nothing disturbs it except the occasional pass of a research vessel. The steel remains, slowly returning to the iron oxide it came from, but the process will take centuries. The artifacts endure, preserved by temperature and pressure, protected by law and respect. Hood is not lost. She is exactly where she has been since May 24, 1941, resting on the North Atlantic floor, her story told by the debris field that marks her grave. The ocean keeps her now, in the cold darkness where memory becomes geology and steel becomes stone.